Right, let's have a look at the brand new Toro Rosso Honda STR13. That's definitely the biggest change with this car for 2018 is the fact that it's now powered by Honda. That power unit that we've seen struggle so much in all of those years in the back of that McLaren now moves down the pit lane to Toro Rosso. What does that mean? Well, for all the reasons we talked about McLaren having been compromised because of that late engine switch to Renault, of course exactly the same things apply here at Red Bull. They also had the same late decision in switching power unit from Renault to Honda, and all the things that go with that in terms of packaging it inside the bodywork, adapting the installation of all of the equipment and the ancillaries that go alongside that Honda power unit become a huge challenge in the time frame that they had to do it in. We also know that the Honda power unit is not dramatically changed from last year. It's an evolution of what they had, and that means we also know that unlike the Renault that Toro Rosso had before, the turbo on the Honda unit is split into two sections. So the compressor is at one end of the engine, the turbine at the other end of the engine. So one half of that sits in front of the engine, one half sits at the back, with the MGUH sat in the middle of the V of the engine. On the Renault, the whole thing sits on the back of the engine. Now what that means is that this car, when it had its Renault engine, would have had the engine, the ICE, pushed up as far forward as it could have done, up against the back of the chassis, because there was no turbo parts in front of that engine. It allows you to install the engine a little bit further forward towards the centre of that car. With the Honda unit, we know that teams can't do that quite as effectively because that compressor and turbine are split and one half of that sits in the front of the engine. It actually means that the engine has to sit a tiny bit further back. Now, that might sound like a tiny detail, and we're probably only talking a few centimetres, but it does make a difference. It means that the designers at Toro Rosso have to shift the way they were working up until that point when the engine switch was announced. They have to change everything, everything that attaches to that as well, of course. The bodywork that slims in around it, all has to be adapted. All of the fittings, all of the radiators, all of the pipe work, the electronic control boxes, everything that go with it, the gearbox that sits on the back, all has to be adapted under real time constraints at that point to make the whole thing fit. We will see if they've made any improvements at Honda, of course, over the coming weeks. I hope they have. I hope we see a reliable car. And from what we saw today, day one of testing in Barcelona, seems pretty reliable. Certainly a lot more reliable than when it was in the back of a McLaren 12 months ago. First car out of the blocks today, first car through the green light, and did a reasonable handful of laps while the conditions were favourable in the morning. It's got a couple of nice details. First of all, I love the livery. It's one of my favourite looking cars. I loved the livery last year. I think they've sort of enhanced it with the red and the Honda stripe down here. I like it. But it's got a few nice aerodynamic tweaks on it as well. And I'm going to talk you through some of those. I mean, you can see from this side shot the fact that the barge boards are quite intricate. Not hugely different to the way that Toro Rosso had their setup last year, but they have added this kind of almost curved, almost semicircular piece in front of the barge boards here, which is designed to turn away this turbulent tyre weight coming off the back of this front tyre, turn it away and get it away from these side pods. That's messy air that they don't want, trying to mess up the flow going into these coolers or air intakes in the side pod. So a few little nice detail changes here, but minimal. This was a nice shot overhead of the front wing. The front wing is quite detailed, but it always was at Toro Rosso. They've got lots of nice bits of detail around the flaps. The reason for having lots of these different split segments of the front wing is all about creating lots of vortices or spinning circles of air coming off these inboard wingtips that can be fast moving and attach themselves and work their way through the underside of the nose and into the barge board area that we keep talking about as being so important, because that controls the way that airflow all goes once it gets through this section off towards the side pods, underneath the floor and round towards the rear of the car. So it all starts here at the front wing. And actually in modern Formula One, these front wings are probably less about creating ultimate downforce as they are about controlling the airflow. So they're much more of a control device than they are an absolute downforce producer, which they certainly were a few years ago. So now the importance is being placed on controlling the airflow to the areas that we need it around the car, as much as it is generating absolute downforce on the front end. So what else can we see here? The nose has changed slightly from last year. They've gone to what is now considered a more conventional setup. 2 channels either side of this little thumb tip, getting as much airflow through here and underneath the nose as we can. Can't quite see it too well on this darkened photo, but they've got what was a originally McLaren designed split wing mount here, which Ferrari have also adapted now in 2018, but also with, I think, 1, 2, 3 splits in it, again just designed to start producing the spinning vortices as the air comes through. Lots of air coming through underneath these nose cones. Now it's a really important area because channeling it through here, as I said before, gets it into this critical area where you can then have absolute control over where it goes from there on in. So now slightly higher noses with these channels either side of the frontal tip, and then the teams find their own ways of working it beyond that. The other thing you can see quite clearly on this picture is this is the S-duct exit. Now I just wanted to show you this because we often see the S-ducts, and almost all cars now have them. But this is a really nice picture. It shows you exactly what's happening. It's almost like a letterbox. That airflow I'm talking about that comes underneath the nose, some of it attaches itself to the underside, the undersurface of this nose cone, where there's another duct somewhere around here where it collects a portion of that air, sends it through a duct in the middle of the nose in a sort of S shape, which is why it's called the S duct, and then feeds it out through the top here. And what that does, as I've said in some of the other videos, it just sends a huge chunk of very fast flowing air along the top surface of the chassis. This point here is where the nose cone rises up and then levels out at the top of the chassis. It's very easy for the flow to detach itself from the surface, the top surface of the car at that point, and that's not what you want. You want to keep that flow attached to the surface where you can keep it under control and work it. The S-duct goes a long way to improving the retaining attachment of that top side's flow structures along the top of the car there. So that's what it is, that's what it looks like. You can of course play with that with various panels to open and close it as the season goes on if you want to fine tune it. They've also gone for a sort of Mercedes style camera mount, and this might seem, you know, almost nothing, but actually these mounts, like we're seeing on the wing mirrors this year, are all being used only in tiny ways, but they're all being used to control airflow. So the same kind of thing here. This is also this little mount that the camera's on. It's just trying to add a little bit of control over the airflow that's passing through the front suspension and on towards the side pod area. Right, nice shot here from overhead looking back, and what you can see on this is some of the detail around the front of the floor and into this barge board section. This is new on the Toro Rosso. This is the sort of under tray floor, or what the teams call the bib section, just behind the nose cone. And just look at the little detail. I mean, that's the sort of thing that's an absolute mechanic's nightmare, because you're going to, crawling around underneath there, you're going to cut yourself on it, you're going to knock them off. But they're all there, these tiny little elements to start spinning up the air and controlling it, as I said before, as it passes through this very difficult turbulent area, creating lots of vortices, which will then be picked up and guided by these barge boards, by the fins in here, to the different places, up to the air intakes here and off around the side of the floor. Other thing to note here, as we've seen on some of the other cars, notably a Mercedes last year, the front top wishbone is now mounted very, very high up on this little extension arm coming out from the upright. The upright of the car is mounted inside the wheel. That's where all the rest of the suspension connects to. The wheel bolts to that upright. This, what looks like a carbon fibre arm here, attached to the top of the upright. Structural, of course, because the suspension is now attached to it, but it just gets this upright very high up. As I mentioned once before in another video, the gap now between top and bottom wishbone, they're trying, on this particular concept, to open up as much as possible, get as much airflow through the centre of that suspension and off towards feeding those air intakes on the side pod and channeling off towards the back of the car. The big thing here that jumps out at me as well is this great big slot. You can see it because the car's been photographed on a white background. Great big slot running along the side of the floor. Not as long as the slots that we saw on the McLaren. If you remember, the McLaren has two long thin slots, but a much wider slot here. But the same sort of principle applies. This is about trying to send airflow down as a kind of curtain of air to seal, if you like, the sides of the floor of the car to the floor of the racetrack, and just try to guide and channel the airflow that's running under the car, really important airflow that's running underneath the car, very fast, very high pressure, that's going to head its way off towards the diffuser at the back, a real big downforce generator. If we can stop airflow spilling out the sides by forming a sort of curtain of air that runs along the side, that will be a great help. And it also helps to protect against this messy tyre wake that I talked about so often coming off these front tyres. So quite an interesting detail, I thought there. Nothing too much yet on this car in the way of chassis vanes up high, like we've seen lots of cars having a vane mounted to the side of the chassis to just help create the sort of, as the front wing turns all the airflow upwards, it rises up off the front wing. We need to get some of that back down again to get into these areas like this intake and to be fed through these areas. So lots of the teams running downward facing winglets on the side here haven't got that yet on the Toro Rosso. Could appear as time goes on, we shall see. So yeah, all very nice. I think that's nice little bits of detail here and there. There is a winglet, as we're seeing on lots of cars now, almost all cars, and I expect all cars to be running this, certainly by the time we get to Australia. A winglet around the top of the halo. I'll show you another picture of that in a moment. Another nice little winglet just above the air intake, and that is again about trying to keep airflow attached to the top of the side pod sides as they feed themselves round towards the rear. Quite a nice, deep and aggressive undercut at this point, but as you move further back, the undercut down towards the back of the car is also quite steep on the Toro Rosso, which in theory should be quite good aerodynamic, should be efficient aerodynamically. This shot just shows you in a little bit more detail this winglet or this aerofoil that is now on the top of this Toro Rosso. Teams are going to be working a lot over the course of these 2 weeks of testing to try different versions of this to see which one works best, what solution works best. I saw the Haas today, which didn't have an aerofoil but had lots of tiny little dagger-like vortex generators mounted along the top of the halo. But they're all there because the halo creates such turbulence, such unwanted turbulence around such critical areas like the air intake for the engine sitting above the driver's head and the rear wing, of course, further back. You can kind of see what it's doing here. With the halo being essentially a sort of big round titanium bar, it's covered in carbon fibre, but it's titanium. If that was left untreated, the airflow coming off that, as you can imagine, would spill up in a very high wake, up here and down underneath. It's not an aerodynamically efficient shape. And what we don't want is the airflow rising straight up and over the top of this critical air intake. We need a fast, free stream of air, as free as we can get, directed and targeted airflow running straight into this air intake, which feeds, of course, the air at the engine. So now, putting this aerofoil on here, you can see what it's doing. It's keeping airflow. Instead of having it just bounce off the top of this rounded structure, we're giving it a little channel to run through between the rounded halo structure and this aerofoil, which then guides it right towards where we need it, which is here, and as I said, right back here towards the rear wing. So you can kind of get the idea of what the teams are trying to do. And I think we're going to see, as I say, lots of different solutions appearing, not just through testing, but even as we go through the first half of this season. This is an absolutely new area that teams haven't had experience with in previous seasons. So it's going to be a crucial area for development. Only tiny developments, of course, but as we know in Formula One, we are looking for every single advantage that you can get, no matter how small they are. So some nice details on this thing. Still haven't really seen the diffuser at the back of the car yet. But I think it looks to me like there's been a bit more work put into the detail of this, which is perhaps not something we could have said about Toro Rosso in the past. You tend to find the lower budget teams, of which Toro Rosso are one, don't have the finance, the resource, or the time, or the people to spend on looking at the finer details. Perhaps the money that's come from Honda for this year has allowed them to do some of that, even though it's come quite late. Perhaps this will give us a sustained challenge from Toro Rosso as the season goes on. Perhaps their development rate will be able to stay a bit higher than it perhaps once was. We shall see. But I hope so. Two young, fairly inexperienced drivers, of course. And that Honda engine, we will just have to wait and see. Wouldn't it be a story if that suddenly came good after switching from McLaren to Toro Rosso? The other thing bubbling away in the background, of course, 2018 is very much a test bed in the back of this Toro Rosso, because the full Red Bull team at the end of 2018 will be out of contract with their current supplier, Renault. Do they take a Honda engine for 2019 and beyond? Probably only if it's good enough. We shall have to wait and see. Right, another one done then. Like the video, please, if you've enjoyed it. Do subscribe to the channel, because there'll be lots more coming over the course of testing, and as I go off racing, I'll be down in Australia for the first race, and we're bringing lots of updates and hopefully some behind the scenes insight from the track itself down in Melbourne. So subscribe to the channel, and please tell everybody about it. Tell your mates. So thank you very much everyone for watching, and I will see you next time. Hit that like button.